Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello everyone and thank you very much for clicking on this video. So if you came there, it's to know more about the pronouns I and en in French. So we won't waste more time and we will begin right now. So let's begin right now with the French pronouns en and I. So I know that in the other languages, just like in English, for example, you don't have this kind of pronouns, but it's very common in French to use this type of pronouns. So you really have to know them. So I will give you a lot of clear explanation and example, and you will have a little exercise at the end to see your own level about what we studied right now. So the first pronoun that we will talk about is en. It's a very important pronoun to consider because it always replaces a complement introduced by de or du, de la, de l'apostrophe and de. So I will explain you later the difference between these type of articles because in fact it's the same. It will just depend on the noun. So I will give you an example right after. So it can also replace a quantity. So when we want to talk about a quantity, we have to put the pronoun en, but there we don't have a real explanation. It's just all the time you have to put this pronoun, but we'll come back on it later. It also translates the some, any, affect, them, so it's very important. And the final very important element that I wrote there is that it's always placed before the verb, so you have to remember this. So we will come back and we will begin with the first article, which is du. So as I told you just before, en is always there to replace the article de that introduces a complement. However, in French, this article de will change depending on the noun. So if the noun, as I just wrote there, is masculine and singular, you will have to put the article tu. If the complement begins by a noun, which is feminine and singular, you will have to put the article de la. Same thing if the nouns of the complement begins with a vowel, you will have to put l'apostrophe. And if the complement begins by a noun, which is to the plural form, you will have to use de. So there, if we take this first example with du, we have café. Café is a singular and masculine noun, so in this case, you have to say du café because the infinitive verb is vouloir de quelque chose. However, this de, as I told you, will change depending on the noun. So there we have a noun that will change because its form is singular and masculine. So you have to make it agree depending on the noun. So in this case, as you can see, en can be used in this case because if we ask the question, tu veux du café? As you can see, the complement is du café because we will always ask the question, tu veux de quoi? You want of what? Du café, of coffee. So in French, I know in English it can be weird to say that, but in French is the idea, it's the idea when we say that in French. We always have to say du café because we're talking about a quantity. So we always have to put this determinant. So, tu veux du café? Oui, j'en veux. And there, this pronoun en is just there to make the person responding who don't have to use once again the pronoun en. So it's just a way to replace a complement that we already mentioned, because in this case, if we were asking the question, tu veux du café? And the person was responding, oui, je veux du café, it would make the sentence very heavy because we already know about what we're talking. So in this case, we can use en to replace the complements du café because anyway the person that asked the question knows that the person who will respond is talking about coffee because he's asking a question about coffee. So it's just as simple as that. And as you can see, and as we talked just before, en will be placed before the verb all the time. It's very important to know that. So oui, j'en veux. So be careful. Next example, so it's basically the same thing, it's just to explain you with another type of noun. So in this case, you have salad. Salad is a feminine and singular noun. So in this case, we have to put the article de la before. It's the same thing as coffee, café, but there it's not a masculine noun, it's a feminine noun. So we have to say, elle prend de la salade? Oui, elle en prend. And same thing, de la salade is the complement. She takes what? She takes de la salade. Elle prend de la salade. So the complement right there has to be replaced, can be replaced by the pronoun en. And it's as simple as that. It's once you understood the use of en, it's very very simple. So oui, elle en prend, and the position of the pronoun is always before the verb. Elle en prend. Yes, she takes. So in English we don't have a direct translation of that, but in French it's very important to know that, because we cannot say oui, elle prend, because the person who asks the question will say what elle prend, like, what does she take? So we have to always put en, which refers to the complement of the first question. Elle prend de la salade. So as you can see, de la salade is the complement of the sentence. So same thing with de l'apostrophe. De l'apostrophe will be used for a noun in the complement which begins by a vowel. So in this case, eau, water, begins by a vowel. So we have to put de l'apostrophe in this case. So, il boit de l'eau. Oui, il en boit. And same thing, the pronoun is placed there to replace the complement in the first question, and it's always placed before the verb. Very important. And same thing with des. Vous avez des amis? Oui, nous en avons. So as you can see, same thing, des introduces a complement that begins with a noun which is to the plural form. So it's very important to notice that for all these cases, even if the noun is masculine, feminine, singular or plural, we always have to put en to replace a complement introduced by de, des, du, de la, and de l'apostrophe. It's very important to know that. So as I told you just before, we always have to put en when we talk about a quantity. If someone asks you, tu as beaucoup de travail? Do you have a lot of work? Oui, j'en ai beaucoup. Yes, I have a lot. So as you can see in French, we cannot say oui, j'ai beaucoup. It's weird. We don't have a real explanation about that, but all the time you want to talk about a quantity, you have to put this pronoun, and the same rule has to be applied there. We have to put the pronoun before the verb, and it's very very important. So right now we can go with the pronoun y, which also, like, the use is quite of similar, because it can also replace a complement or a place as we saw with en, but it will depend, because there, just as we saw with en can replace a complement introduced by the article de. In this case, y can replace a complement introduced by a, chez, dans, sur, en. So you have to be careful, because it won't be used in the same cases. Both of these pronouns can replace a complement, but depending by what type of article preposition is there to introduce the complement, we will use either y, either en. So you have to be careful. And as en, it's always placed before the verb. So for example, if I say tu vas à Paris, in this context is the same thing. Y is there to replace the complement and is there to replace a place. So as you can see, tu vas à Paris. À Paris is the complement. Where are you going? I'm going to Paris. So it's the same thing. And there, this Y is there to replace the complement of localization, the complement of the place. So à Paris will be replaced by Y. Oui, j'y vais. And as you can see, and same thing as the pronoun en, it will always be placed before the verb. So there is also like another example with Y with another place. So à la bibliothèque, it's also a place which is like a complement introduced by the article, the preposition à. So in this case, we have to use Y. Il est allé à la bibliothèque. Oui, il y est allé. And this little pronoun is there to avoid the repetition of the same complement, because it's also correct to say oui, il est allé à la bibliothèque, but it makes the sentence very redundant, and it's something that we don't want to make happen when we talk in French. You know, French people really want to talk very fast and to go to their point very easily, so we took this kind of pronouns to make the speech way much more fluent, way much more smooth. So we have to use I in this case. So, il est allé à la bibliothèque. Oui, il y est allé. We can also use y with certain type of verbs that are called prepositional verbs. So it's just like in English, if for example I say to talk about something, we always have to keep this preposition which is about. We can't remove this when we want to say to talk about something. It's a preposition that will never be like removed or something, and it's very important to know that because in French we have the same thing. So all these verbs that begin with like which are always used with a preposition such as un, will always have to put the pronoun y when you want to replace the complement, because all the time these kind of verbs will introduce a complement that begin by a. So it's just very as simple as that. So if you have a prepositional verbs that end with a, with this preposition, you can always replace the complement by the pronoun y. So it's very important. Tu penses à ton avenir? Oui, j'y pense. Same thing, the pronoun I replaces the complement à ton avenir. So it's very important to know that because it's always the same thing. And so here's another example. So just as penser à, réfléchir à is a prepositional verb. So in this case, we have to use the pronoun y if we want to replace the complement that will be introduced by this preposition à. Elle réfléchit à la solution. À la solution is the complement introduced by the verb réfléchir à, which is placed right after the verb. So, elle y réfléchit à la solution. Oui, elle y réfléchit. And the pronoun y is there to replace the complement introduced by the complement with a. So it's as simple as that. So if you have like any prepositional verbs that has a inside, such as penser à, réfléchir à, all these kind of verbs, after that, if you want to replace the complement by a pronoun, it's always the pronoun y, I, that you will use. So now, we'll just make a little recap of everything we saw. So un versus I. So un replaces de, du, de la, des, de, l'apostrophe, as we saw just before. That will change. You notice little article that will change depending on the gender and on the form of the noun. So if it's singular, plural, feminine or masculine, you know, it will always replaces these complements that are introduced by this article that can change depending on the noun. It can also replaces a quantity, and there we don't have like a real rules about that. It's very important to know that. Y can also replaces a complement, however it will be for a plus a place or something. So as you can see on I are there to replace a complement, but both of them won't be used in the same case, depending on what kind of article or preposition will introduce the complement. We will use either un or either I. So, tu veux du pain? Oui, j'en veux. So in this case, we cannot put I there. We cannot say oui, j'y veux, because the complement is introduced by de, or like one of these like variation, like du, de la, de l'apostrophe des. So in this case, we cannot put y, because if we look at the rule with y, it always replaces a complement introduced by a or chez, all these things that we saw like just before, but chez, dans, sur, en, but we cannot like replaces a complement introduced by de or like du, des, de l'apostrophe, de la, with the complement, with the pronoun, y. So it's very important. On the same way, tu vas à l'école, we cannot say oui, j'en vais. Like, we cannot say that because there the complement is introduced by the preposition a. So in this case, we cannot say tu vas, oui, j'en vais. Tu vas à l'école? Oui, j'en vais. We cannot say that because it's wrong, because the complement is introduced by de, la, etc., etc. So same thing. So now you have like this practice example. So I will just ask you in the comments if you're like interested to complete these little sentences and to try to explain me why you would put un or y, and to try to see if you got this. You can read, like you can listen, one more time the video to see if you like understood all the concepts. But if you do, you will see it's very simple. Don't hesitate to send me your responses in the commentaries. I will be very happy to correct you. So we also have to talk about in expressions before like finishing the lesson, because sometimes we have some expression in French where we have to use but we really don't know why. So this kind of expressions, or like what we call structure figée, it means that like expressions that never change. J'en ai marre, we have to use but we don't know why we have to use in this case. It's just the expression itself, which is called a fixed expression. J'en peux plus, j'en rêve, etc., etc., etc. It's all of this expression. It's just a common expression that we have in French, but as I wrote there, here on doesn't replace a clear word. We don't know really about what we're talking, but it's just like a part of the expression. So as we saw before, en is also used with the quantities. When you want to say j'en ai beaucoup, j'en ai peu, j'en ai deux, j'en ai trois, we don't really know why we have to put en in this case. It just say the expression itself. We always obligate the people to use en. Always keep the quantity after en. And it's also very important. So as you can say, we will always say en plus the verb plus the quantity. So you always have to remember this, and it's always the same like structure. An important thing that we didn't talk about, and it's the same thing for I and en cannot replaces people. Tu parles de Paul, so as I told you until now, en can replace a complement introduced by de, du, etc., etc. However, if the complement is talking about a person, you cannot say en or y. You have to use a tonic pronoun. So I don't know if you know about this, but I recommend you to see more about this because it's also very common in French. I will make a video if it does interest you. Don't hesitate to tell me in the comments if it does interest you. And yeah, it's very important. So in this case, we cannot choose en and y. So also something very important is the place of the pronouns en and y with compound tenses such as passé composé, when we have like the auxiliary and the past participle. So tu as pris du pain, oui j'en ai pris, oui j'y suis allé, tu es allé à Paris, oui j'y suis allé. So as you can see in these two cases, we will always put the pronouns en and y before the auxiliary suis and before the past participle. So we have pronoun auxiliary past participle, pronoun auxiliary past participle. So it's just as simple as that. With negation, we also have to be careful. Tu veux du café? Non, je n'en veux pas. So as you can see, we will put the first negative element, the pronoun, verb, second negation element. Same thing with y. Tu vas à Lyon? Non, je n'y vais pas. First negative element, pronoun, verb, and second element of negation. So, and if we want to mix everything and talk about the competencies plus the negation, we have to also follow a specific order. So, tu as pris du sucre? Non, je n'en ai pas pris. So it's very important to know that. So we have the first element of negation plus the pronoun plus the auxiliary plus the second negative element plus the past participle. And it's the same thing with y. Tu es allé au cinéma? Non, je n'y suis pas allé. So thank you very much for listening to this video. Now you know everything about the French pronouns en and y. Don't hesitate to send me your exercise at the end of the video, and also don't hesitate to ask me any question if something is not clear. I will be very happy to give you more explanation in the comments. Thank you very much and see you soon. Bye bye.